Donald Trump is expected to sign around 200 executive actions within 1 hour of being sworn in. And as you recall from his campaign, he made quite a few promises about day one. Let's just quickly look back at what he pledged to do if re-elected. Trump has sworn to, quote, shut down the border within hours of taking office. That includes a mass deportation campaign of undocumented immigrants, bringing back Title 42, the COVID-era restrictions on asylum at the border, and the Remain in Mexico program, which kept asylum seekers there until their court date. He also said he would end birthright citizenship, which would likely also require a constitutional amendment since it's a right protected by the 14th Amendment. On the economy, Trump pledged to, quote, immediately remove every single burdensome regulation driving up the cost of goods. And that would entail for different federal agencies, what it would entail, I should say, for different federal agencies is not entirely clear. But he also promised to implement a 25% tariff on all Mexican and Canadian imports. One promise Trump appears keen to keep involves the January 6 rioters. He reiterated at a rally last night that he'll issue pardons on his first day in office. The president-elect told supporters, quote, everybody in this very large arena will be very happy with my decision, end quote. More than 1,200 people have been convicted on charges related to the Capitol riot. Trump has also promised to remove protections for transgender students, and his plans include cutting federal funding for schools that promote critical race theory or other content that he finds objectionable. For example, lessons about LGBTQ people, race, or politics. And at last night's rally, Trump spoke about his plans to save TikTok and an executive action to build an Iron Dome missile defense shield around the country. So what does this all mean in reality? Let's bring in our political panel, Justin Sayfie and Hyma Moore. Justin is a Republican strategist who previously served as a senior advisor for former Florida Governor Jeb Bush. And Hyma is the former director of the Office of the DNC Chair. A warm welcome to you both this Monday morning. Justin, let's start with you. Trump has pledged 200 executive orders. What do we make of that bold number and what they will likely contain?
Well, I think it shows that he wants to hit the ground running, that he campaigned on a certain platform. He made promises to the American people, and that he intends to keep those promises and not waste a single moment. Obviously, as been mentioned, the biggest issues are immigration, the border, getting that under control, that the 55% of the American people, according to a New York Times poll, say they want mass deportations of all illegal immigrants in the United States. The American people are expecting Donald Trump to carry through on that promise. And if he doesn't, he'll have a problem with the American people. And I think the other issue, as we talked about earlier in the segment, was the war in Ukraine, bringing peace to Ukraine and to Europe. And we've already started to see the peace that's been brought in the Middle East.
I want to throw a question to Hyma now, based on our new CBS News polling, and we can show it for our viewers as well. You've got 55% of Americans who support Trump's proposed policies to deport all immigrants who are in the country illegally. That number jumps up to 90% among Trump voters. So how should Democrats navigate this?
Yeah, look, I don't think any Democrat would say that the immigration issue has not been a winning issue for Donald Trump. And I do think that most Democrats across this country believe that we have to do something about the border. But here's the reality, Errol. I think when you think about why Donald Trump is here back in D.C. right now, there are two reasons: high cost and high inflation. And so you could talk about immigration, you could talk about the wars and other things, but I do think the vast majority of Americans send him back here to lower their costs. Housing costs are too high, groceries are too high, inflation's too high. And so I think when Donald Trump's going to be measured, he's going to be measured on how has he made American lives easier, less costly, how has he brought housing costs down. And so I think all these executive orders are going to be interesting for his politics, but the real test is going to be, can he make these lives of Americans better by bringing costs down?
Yeah, and as we just showed on the polling there, inflation and the economy, the issues most Americans want Trump to address right away. I want to ask you both about TikTok. I know you're both prolific on the app. I'm sure if I search your names, I'll see dancing videos. But you may have noticed that when it went off and online over the weekend, there was a message mentioning President Trump. Of course, up until noon, he's president-elect, thanking him for assuring the company that it would make efforts to bring it back online, and now folks can use it. And of course, the CEO of the company is at Trump's inauguration with prominent seating. Justin, what do you make of this?
Well, I think that President Trump, again, he realizes that the app is very popular, but he announced yesterday during his rally in Washington that he'd like to see American ownership, a 50-50 American ownership, 50% American ownership, 50% Chinese ownership. It made me wonder why, when I heard that, why hadn't the Biden administration proposed that? That was the point. So I think that you're seeing already, even before he takes office, some of the things that Donald Trump is doing before he takes office.
And Hyma, what did you make of that really almost like an ad for Trump for anyone who uses the platform?
Yeah, I think it was weird, but look, I think that's a political theater that Donald Trump's really good at. Look, Joe Biden said and Kamala Harris said they would not enforce any of those laws that would have taken TikTok down, and so TikTok did not have to go down this weekend, and that was a choice of the ownership to give Donald Trump an advantage. And so here's the reality of the next 4 years. We're looking at a lot of political gamemanship, a lot of political theater. I think people do not want to see that. People want to see things get done as quickly as possible, be it by Donald Trump or by Joe Biden. But I think all this political gamemanship is just not fair. Think about how we got here. Donald Trump called for the end of TikTok years and years ago. Congress put in place a set of laws that were bipartisan that allowed for it to happen. The courts upheld this. And so I think there are real issues that we have to look at when we think about TikTok, not just Donald Trump bringing TikTok back over the weekend.
And let's also just do some fact checking because, Justin, as we've mentioned for you both, the economy and inflation are Americans' top concerns. One of Trump's campaign pledges is to implement tariffs, various tariffs. You can't have both, right? If you implement tariffs, things are more expensive for people. Their cost of living will increase. So, Justin, how should all of this expect to work?
Well, I think that he wants to impose tariffs. He wants to rebalance trade around the world. There are too many countries that are benefiting more than America is from trade, and there needs to be a rebalancing. I think for him, it's a negotiating tactic. I'm not saying that he won't do it. I believe he will do it. But I think that it will be done in a way that other countries can talk about their economic relationship with the United States. And I think we saw when he imposed the tariffs during his first term, there were things that he could do to address the economic harm that was suffered by some Americans who were on the losing side of those tariffs. But the point is that not all Americans have benefited from globalization. Some have, some haven't. And these tariffs are a way to reestablish or rebalance the trade relationship we have so that more Americans can benefit from globalization.
I wish I had more time to speak to you both, but I appreciate your insight on this approaching first day of the Trump presidency. Justin Sayfie, Hyma Moore, thank you both.
Good to see you. Absolutely.
Thank you.